There are places in the universe where reality bends to accommodate something deeper than physics. Silent Hill was one such place. Not a town in the traditional sense, but a mirror. A place where guilt took form and punishment became inevitable. Within its fog-drenched streets and rusted corridors, the sins of those who entered were given shape and teeth and the terrible patience of consequence itself. Pyramid Head was born from that principle. Not a demon. Not a monster in any conventional understanding. He was judgment made flesh. An executioner without mercy because mercy was never the purpose. He existed because someone needed to be punished. Because guilt left unresolved becomes a wound that festers until something arrives to cut it clean. He carried a blade too heavy for any human to lift. He wore a helmet that denied him sight because sight was irrelevant. The guilty did not need to be seen. They needed to be found. For years, perhaps centuries in the warped timeline of Silent Hill, he served this function, appearing when the weight of sin became unbearable, dragging the blade behind him with that terrible scraping sound that announced judgment long before it arrived. He was not cruel. Cruelty requires emotion. He simply was, an inevitability wearing the shape of something that could swing a sword. But even manifestations require context. Pyramid Head existed because Silent Hill existed, because guilt needed a place to concentrate and a form to punish it. Remove the context and what remains? An executioner without a courtroom. A sentence without a crime. A punishment searching for purpose. The fracture began on a dying human colony at the edge of Imperial space. A place so forgotten that even the administratum had lost its records beneath centuries of bureaucratic sediment. The colonists had been left to survive alone. And in their isolation they had done what humans do when desperation removes the veneer of civilization. They had committed atrocities to survive. Cannibalism masked as rationing. Murder disguised as necessity. Guilt layered so thick it became the air they breathed. When the warp storms came, drawn by the psychic weight of collective sin, the barrier between realities thinned. Not broke, not shattered, just thinned enough for something to slip through the cracks. The Imperium touched that forsaken colony and found guilt concentrated enough to resemble the fog of Silent Hill. And in that moment of resonance, Pyramid Head was pulled from his context. The transition was not violent. There was no struggle. He simply walked through a doorway that had not existed a moment before and found himself nowhere. The colony was gone. Silent Hill was gone. Only the warp remained. An ocean of screaming emotion and fractured reality where demons swam through currents of rage and despair and the laughter of thirsting gods echoed across impossible dimensions. He stood in that chaos, blade in hand, helmet reflecting nothing. The warp tried to understand him, tried to categorize him into the structures it knew. Was he rage? Rage burns hot and consumes itself. Was he despair? Despair collapses inward and weeps. Was he ambition? Pleasure? Decay? None of these. He was consequence, pure and uncomplicated. The thing that arrives after the crime has been committed and the excuses have run dry. The warp had no framework for consequence. Chaos thrives on excess and denial, on the refusal to accept limitation or accountability. It is the scream of appetite unchained and desire, given infinite expression. Judgment is antithetical to its nature. And so the Imperium, for perhaps the first time in its eternal existence, hesitated. Pyramid Head began to walk, not toward anything, not away from anything, simply forward. The warp twisted around him, trying to corrupt what it touched, but finding nothing to corrupt. He had no desires to inflate, no fears to exploit, no pride to shatter. He was a function, an algorithm of punishment, and functions do not negotiate. Somewhere in the screaming chaos, demons watched. Lesser entities driven by curiosity and hunger circled at a distance, sensing prey but confused by the absence of fear. Greater powers, the fragments of dark gods that drifted through the warp like continents of malice, turned their attention briefly toward this anomaly before moving on. He was too small to threaten them, too strange to consume, too empty to corrupt. But as Pyramid Head walked through the Imperium, something began to happen. He was drawn, not by choice, not by will, but by the same principle that had always guided him. He moved toward guilt, and in a galaxy drowning in 10,000 years of atrocity, guilt was everywhere. It radiated from a million worlds like heat from dying stars, the weight of every necessary evil. Every justified massacre, every child sacrificed for the survival of the species, every truth buried beneath the propaganda of necessity. The warp currents began to carry him toward real space, toward the Imperium where guilt was not abstract but embodied in flesh and blood, and the choices made by beings who could still feel shame even if they had learned to ignore it. Pyramid Head did not know where he was going. He did not need to know. Judgment does not require a map. It only requires the guilty. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the guilty were infinite. The Imperium is not empty. It is the opposite of empty. It is too full, overstuffed with the emotional residue of countless trillions of sentient beings across the galaxy. Every fear, every hope, every moment of ecstasy and every instant of suffering poured into a dimension that has no distance and no time, only intensity, only meaning made manifest. Demons are born from this. Creatures of pure concept given teeth and will. They are rage that hungers, despair that spreads, pleasure that devours, ambition that builds empires from screaming souls. They are not alive in any biological sense. They are alive in the way a fire is alive, consuming, spreading, seeking fuel. When Pyramid Head entered the warp, the demons sensed him immediately. A new presence. Potentially prey, potentially threat. They circled like sharks drawn to blood and water, trying to determine which category he occupied. But as they drew closer, something unexpected happened. Recognition. Not recognition of identity. Demons do not remember faces, but recognition of nature. Pyramid Head was shaped by emotion just as they were. Not born from it perhaps, but forged by it. Guilt had given him form. Punishment had given him purpose. In that sense he was kin. A reflection cast by the same forces that birthed every horror swimming through the warp. But he was also wrong. The demons could feel it. A discordance. They thrived on excess. On the moment when feeling overwhelmed, reason and control shattered into beautiful chaos. Pyramid Head was the opposite. He was limitation incarnate. The end of excess. The boundary that said this far and no further. He was the consequence that arrived when indulgence went too far. A bloodletter, one of Khorne's lesser demons, manifested near him. Drawn by curiosity and the blood god's endless hunger for conflict, it raised its hellblade and screamed a challenge that echoed across 3 dimensions simultaneously. Pyramid Head did not respond, did not turn, simply continued walking through the formless void with that same patient inevitability. The bloodletter charged. Its blade, forged from rage and sharpened on the screams of the dying, swung toward Pyramid Head's neck. The executioner moved, not quickly, not with the supernatural speed of a warrior, but with certainty. His massive blade, rusted and stained and impossibly heavy, caught the demon's weapon mid-swing. For a moment they stood locked together, rage against judgment. Then the bloodletter began to unravel, not destroyed in the traditional sense, but unmade, as if the contact with Pyramid Head forced it to confront something its nature could not accommodate. Khorne's demon existed because rage was eternal and battle was sacred. But what is rage when faced with consequence? What is the glory of violence when judgment follows inevitably? The bloodletter flickered. Returned to the warp as formless energy, its temporary manifestation unable to sustain itself in proximity to something so fundamentally opposed to its existence. Pyramid Head continued walking. Other demons watched, learned, began to maintain distance. Not from fear. Fear implies self-preservation and demons are too alien for such simple emotions. But from instinct. The same instinct that keeps predators from attacking things that smell like poison. A horror of Tsinch, multi-eyed and shimmering with stolen knowledge, drifted closer. Tsinch is the changer of ways. The god of ambition and sorcery, and the belief that everything can be manipulated toward advantage. Its demon studied Pyramid Head with 1,000 eyes, calculating, searching for the angle, the leverage point, the way to turn this anomaly into a weapon or tool or pawn. It found nothing. Pyramid Head had no ambition to exploit, no desire for power or knowledge or change. He existed in a state of perfect stasis, unchanging, unmoved by possibility. The horror attempted to weave an illusion, to show Pyramid Head a false reality where his purpose could be expanded or his nature altered. The illusion shattered before it formed, not because Pyramid Head resisted, but because he did not perceive possibility. Only truth, only guilt, only punishment. The horror withdrew, disturbed in a way demons rarely experience. Tines servants thrive on complexity and the infinite branching paths of what might be. Pyramid Head was singular, inevitable. He represented a kind of certainty that the architect of fate found philosophically repulsive. Even Nurgle's children, the plague-bearers who catalog every disease and decay with patient devotion, found him unsettling. They approached with their usual dispassionate curiosity, examining this new thing with the detachment of cosmic accountants. But Pyramid Head did not decay, did not change, was not touched by entropy despite standing in a realm where entropy was metaphor made flesh. He was preserved in his purpose, locked in his function. And that stasis, that refusal to rot or evolve, made him alien even to the most patient of chaos gods. Only Slaaneshi's demons tried to embrace him. The youngest god, the prince of pleasure, seeks sensation above all else. Pain or ecstasy, agony or joy, all are equal in their intensity. Demonettes slithered close, offering whispers of exquisite suffering and transcendent punishment, promising to show him pleasures in the act of judgment itself, to transform his purpose into art. Pyramid Head walked through them, not around, as if they were smoke, insubstantial. Slaaneshi's servants tried to cling to him, to find some sensation they could amplify or twist. But there was nothing. He felt nothing, not pleasure, not pain, not even the grim satisfaction of duty fulfilled. He was empty of everything except function. The warp began to avoid him. Not consciously. The Imperium has no unified mind, but in the way water flows around stone, the tides of chaos began to part as Pyramid Head walked, creating a wake of silence in the screaming void. Demons no longer approached. They watched from a distance, trying to understand what he was, trying to categorize him into their hierarchies of threat and resource. But he fit no category. He was not chaos, not order, not ally, not enemy. He was consequence. And consequences in a realm built on the denial of consequence was the most alien thing imaginable. Pyramid Head walked on, following the psychic scent of guilt, moving toward the Imperium where souls still had bodies and choices still mattered and punishment could be delivered with the swing of a blade. The warp watched him go, and in its own incomprehensible way it felt something it rarely experienced. Relief. Hive Tertius was unremarkable by imperial standards. A world of 60 billion souls stacked in towers that pierced the clouds and descended into darkness kilometers below the surface. The upper spires housed nobility who had never breathed unfiltered air. The middle levels churned with endless factories where workers lived and died without seeing sky. The lower depths were spoken of only in whispers, places where the desperate and forgotten survived on refuse and the occasional body that fell from above. The system worked, not well, not justly, but it worked. Production quotas were met. Tithes were paid. The Imperium asked no questions as long as the conveyor belt of resources continued. What happened inside those towers was irrelevant to distant Terra. The nobles exploited workers. The Arbites turned blind eyes for bribes. Priests preached endurance while hoarding wealth in hidden vaults. It was a machine of cruelty oiled by hypocrisy. Sustainable. Necessary. Then the disappearances began. Not unusual in a hive city. People vanished every day into the industrial grinders or gang violence or simple starvation. But these disappearances were different. Targeted. A factory overseer who had ordered safety equipment removed to meet quotas. A merchant prince who trafficked in workers too injured to labor. A priest who absolved sins for payment while condemning the poor for their poverty. They were found days later. Not murdered in the conventional sense. No lasbor, no knife wounds, no signs of struggle. They simply looked as if something had broken inside them. Eyes wide, mouths frozen open, bodies positioned in strange tableaus that investigators could not quite parse. It was as if they had been forced to see something, to confront something, and the seeing had killed them. Rumors started in the lower hives first. Workers whispered of a figure seen in the corners of vision. Tall, wearing a red pyramid for a head, dragging something heavy behind it. The sound echoed through the metal corridors. Scrape, a rhythm like a heartbeat, like inevitability counting down. The nobles laughed at first. Superstition. The lower classes inventing bogeymen to explain away murders that were probably gang-related or the result of some toxin in the recycled air. The Arbites investigated with their usual thoroughness, which is to say, barely at all. They filed reports, categorized the deaths as suspicious but low priority, moved on to more pressing matters like quelling a food riot in sublevel 47. Then a high-ranking administratum official vanished from his secured quarters. The room was locked from inside. No signs of forced entry. Surveillance footage showed nothing. He was simply there one moment and gone the next. They found him 3 days later in the chapel of the Emperor's Judgment, kneeling before the altar. His face locked in an expression that the investigators could only describe as realization. His records were audited as standard procedure after death. What they found was decades of embezzlement. Funds meant for food distribution diverted into private accounts. Requisitions for medical supplies sold on black markets, while plague wards went without antibiotics. Thousands had died because of his greed. Maybe tens of thousands. The numbers were too large and too diffuse to calculate precisely. The Arbites sealed the records. Officially, he died of heart failure. Unofficially, they began to worry. More deaths followed. Always someone with secrets. Always someone whose crimes were hidden but real. A guild master who used slave labor and reported them as servitors. A general who had ordered civilians executed to deny resources to an enemy that never materialized. A judge who took bribes to convict the innocent and free the guilty. The pattern was undeniable. Something was hunting the guilty. Not indiscriminately, not randomly, with precision. As if it could see past the lies and justifications and rationalizations straight into the core of what they had done. The nobles began to panic quietly. You do not survive in the upper spires without compromises, without blood on your hands, without decisions that sacrificed others for your benefit. It was not cruelty. It was necessity. The Imperium ran on such necessities. Everyone understood this. Everyone participated. Guilt was the price of power, and power was the only thing that kept you from falling into the lower levels where life was measured in shifts worked until your body gave out. But now something was collecting on that price. And locked doors meant nothing. Guards meant nothing. Wealth meant nothing. The executioner came for those who had earned his attention. And earning his attention required only one thing: guilt that could not be denied even by the one who carried it. A planetary governor tried to flee, boarded his personal shuttle in the dead of night with a handful of loyal guards. They found the shuttle drifting in orbit a week later. The guards were alive, unconscious but alive. The governor was dead in his seat. No wound, just that same expression, that terrible realization. When they searched his private files, they found records of a rebellion he had crushed 15 years prior. Not a chaos rebellion, not a threat to imperial rule. Just workers asking for breathable air in the factory districts. He had ordered the ventilation systems flooded with toxins. 60,000 dead in a single night. The Imperium had commended him for his swift action, efficiency, decisive leadership. The bodies were recycled into corpse starch and no one spoke of it again. Until now. Until something came that did not care about efficiency or necessity or the brutal calculus of imperial survival. Something that only cared about the 60,000 dead and the man who gave the order. The lower hive workers noticed something strange. The fear was moving upward. For once in the long and terrible history of the Imperium, the powerful were more afraid than the powerless. Those with nothing to hide had nothing to fear. The laborers who survived each day through pure endurance. The mothers who stretched rations to feed their children. The injured who helped each other when no medici would descend to their levels. They heard the scraping sound in the distance and felt no dread. It was not for them. It had never been for them. Judgment came only for those who had judged themselves above consequence. And for the first time in their lives, the lowest levels of Hive Tertius felt something almost forgotten. They felt safe. The Inquisition does not arrive quickly. It arrives inevitably. When unexplained deaths stack high enough. When local authorities file reports with the correct coded phrases that translate to "we have lost control of the situation and require intervention." When the pattern suggests corruption beyond normal parameters, then the Inquisition comes, and worlds tremble. Inquisitor Valen arrived on Hive Tertius with a retinue of acolytes, a squad of battle sisters from the Order of the Bloody Rose. and a single sanctioned psyker whose eyes had been replaced with augmetic sensors that allowed her to see the warp's touch on real space. Valen was old. Not in years necessarily, rejuvenate treatments kept his body strong, but old in experience. He had seen every flavor of corruption the galaxy offered. Tinekian cults that traded sanity for knowledge. Slaaneshi covens that pursued sensation into damnation. Genestealer infestations that wore human faces until the moment they struck. He knew the signs, knew the patterns. This was none of them. The briefing files troubled him before he even made planetfall. Targeted death, no warp signatures, no mutations, no witnesses. No coherent modus operandi beyond the selection of victims who all possessed hidden crimes. It read like a morality play, like someone was punishing sinners. But the galaxy did not work that way. The Emperor punished heresy and Xenos and traitors. The Imperium punished failure and disloyalty and weakness. But guilt, personal moral culpability for acts committed in service of survival, that was not Imperial doctrine. That was something else. His first action was to interview the Arbites who had investigated initially. They were defensive, certain he would find them lacking. Valen ignored their fear and focused on facts. Had they detected any warp disturbances? Any xenotech? Any pattern to the timing of deaths? Only that they seemed to accelerate. One per week became one per day. And the victims were becoming more diverse. Not just corrupt nobles now, but anyone guilty of sufficient crime. Valen ordered the psyker, a woman named Serene, whose augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as they cycled through spectrums invisible to human sight, to examine the most recent death scene. A merchant who had been selling recycled corpse starch labeled as fresh protein, not technically illegal. The Imperium wasted nothing, but he had been marketing it to parents as nutrition for infants. Children had died, malnutrition masked by falsified purity reports. They found him in his warehouse office, seated at his desk, hands folded, dead for approximately 6 hours. Serene walked the room slowly, her augmetic eyes scanning surfaces and air for psychic residue. After 10 minutes, she turned to Valen and shook her head. Nothing. No warp echo. No demonic presence. No psychic imprint at all. It was as if he had simply decided to die and his body had obeyed. But his expression. Valen had seen death in every form. Peaceful. This was none of those. This was recognition. The merchant had seen something in his final moments, something that forced him to confront what he had done. And the confrontation had been fatal. Valen ordered autopsies. The medici found nothing. No poisons, no diseases, no physiological cause of death. Brain activity had simply stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. But the brain does not work that way. It does not just turn off without cause. Yet here were 47 bodies that suggested otherwise. The Inquisitor convened a meeting with the planetary authorities. Arbites Commander, Ecclesiarchy Cardinal, Administratum Sector Chief. He laid out the facts as he understood them. Something was killing people on this world. Something that selected victims based on guilt. Something that left no trace and could not be detected by any means available to the Imperium. He watched their faces carefully as he spoke. They were terrified, not of the killer, of being selected. Every person in that room had risen to power through compromise and cruelty. That was not judgment, it was observation. The Imperium did not reward mercy, it rewarded results. And results often required stepping on bodies to reach. They were guilty of everything necessary to survive in their positions. And now something was punishing necessity itself. The Cardinal tried to frame it as divine judgment, the Emperor cleansing the world of hidden sin. Valen shut that down immediately. The Emperor worked through his Imperium, through doctrine and law and the clear hierarchy of command. He did not send silent executioners to murder Imperial officials without trial or pronouncement. That was not order. That was chaos of a different kind. But if not the Emperor, then what? A Xenos weapon? Valen considered it. But what Xenos understood human guilt well enough to weaponize it? The Eldar were too alien in psychology. The Tau would simply shoot you. Tyranids consumed everything equally. Orcs did not have the subtlety. Necrons did not care about morality. No known Xenos species fit the profile. A rogue psyker? Serene insisted it was impossible. A psyker powerful enough to kill without leaving a warp trace would be powerful enough to attract demonic attention. The planet would be drowning in warp phenomena. But there was nothing. The immaterium around Hive Tertius was calmer than it had been in years. Valen began to suspect something worse than xenos or chaos. He began to suspect that they were facing something unprecedented. A new kind of threat that did not fit any category the Imperium had prepared for. And the Imperium, for all its vast resources and 10,000 years of experience, did not adapt well to the unprecedented. Meanwhile, in the lower hives, something unexpected was happening. Productivity was increasing, not because of fear, but because workers felt safer. The overseers who beat them for minor infractions were gone. The gang bosses who extorted protection money had vanished. The corrupt medici who demanded bribes for treating injuries had stopped showing up to their clinics. And into the vacuum stepped people who actually wanted to help, who had always been there but too afraid to act. A black market network emerged that distributed food stolen from noble warehouses, not for profit, for need. Volunteer medics began operating in the deep levels, treating the injured without payment. Workers organized quietly, setting their own safety standards since no one else would. It was not rebellion, not yet, but it was something the Imperium found almost as dangerous. It was people realizing they did not need their oppressors. Valen received reports of this growing order from below and found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to maintain imperial authority, to crush anything that resembled independence or self-organization outside official channels. But how could he condemn people for filling the vacuum left by officials who had been executed for crimes against those same people? How could he punish the victims for surviving in the absence of their victimizers? The situation was destabilizing. Not through violence, through justice. And justice in the carefully balanced nightmare of the Imperium was a more dangerous weapon than any blade. Valen stood in his commandeered office in the upper spire and looked out over Hive Tertius. Somewhere in those endless metal corridors, something was walking. Something that killed with perfect precision. Something that the Imperium could not detect or stop or even understand. And worse, something that made the common citizens feel safer while the authorities lived in fear. He had fought demons and heretics in Xenos horrors. He had stared into the warp and kept his sanity through faith and will. But this was something else entirely. This was a threat that did not fight, that did not corrupt, that simply punished. And the Imperium, built on 10,000 years of necessary sins, had no defense against punishment itself. The cult had been growing in the underhive for years. Patient, careful not to attract attention until their numbers were sufficient. They worshipped Slaaneshi, though they did not use that name in their recruiting. They spoke of liberation, of transcendence, of experiencing sensation beyond the dull grinding misery of hive life. And in the depths where every day was identical and hope had been dead for generations, such promises found fertile ground. Their leader was a woman named Calvara. Once she had worked the factorums, breathed toxic air, felt her body breaking down shift by shift. Then she found the cult, felt the touch of something beyond, experienced pleasure so intense it redefined her understanding of existence. She became a believer, and eventually a summoner. They chose a night when the Arbites were focused on the upper spire disturbances, when the Inquisition was occupied with its investigations, when security was stretched thin and no one was watching the forgotten depths. 63 cultists gathered in an abandoned water reclamation facility. They carved the symbols into flesh and metal, spoke the words in a language that hurt the throat to pronounce, spilled blood and other fluids in patterns that pleased the Prince of Pleasure. The warp responded. A tear opened in real space, barely a meter wide, but enough. Demonettes began to pour through, beautiful and terrible, offering ecstasy with one hand and death with the other. The cultists welcomed them with open arms and open veins. The ritual was succeeding. Soon the tier would widen. More demons would come. The underhive would burn in sensation and the cult would ascend to something beyond mortality. Then the scraping sound began. Distant at first, metal dragging on metal, echoing through the empty facility. The cultists paused, looked toward the entrance. The demonettes turned, their too many eyes focusing on the darkness beyond the ritual circle. Even they sensed something, a presence that did not belong. Pyramid Head emerged from the shadows, walking with that same patient inevitability, the massive blade dragging behind him. the red pyramid helmet reflecting the firelight in strange angles. He did not rush, did not charge, simply walked toward the ritual as if it were his destination all along. Calvara screamed for the demons to attack. The demonettes moved, inhumanly fast, claws extended, mouths open in shrieks that promised pain indistinguishable from pleasure. They swarmed Pyramid Head from 3 directions simultaneously. Professional, coordinated. These were predators born from eons of hunting souls. They knew how to kill. Their claws struck his body and skittered off as if hitting something harder than ceramite. Their beautiful faces contorted in confusion. Slaaneshi's servants knew every nerve cluster, every point of pain and pleasure in mortal forms. But Pyramid Head offered no response. No pain, no pleasure, no acknowledgement at all. He swung the blade. It was not a skilled strike. No technique, no finesse. Just overwhelming force delivered with mechanical certainty. The blade passed through the first demonette and the creature came apart. Not killed, not banished in the traditional sense, but unmade, as if its existence was predicated on assumptions that Pyramid Head's presence contradicted. The demon flickered. Returned to the warp not in defeat but in philosophical impossibility. The other demonettes retreated. Not from fear. They did not know fear, but from instinct. Something in their nature, some fundamental understanding written into their essence by Slaanesh, told them that this was wrong. That contact with this thing was dangerous not to their forms but to their concepts. Pyramid Head turned toward the warp tier, the rift through which the demons had entered. He walked toward it and the demonettes parted before him, still hissing, still circling, but not attacking. They could feel it now, what he was, not an enemy they could fight, but consequence itself, and consequences unmake excess. Turn pleasure into regret. Transform sensation into suffering not through opposition but through simple conclusion. He reached the tier, raised his blade, brought it down. The rift did not close so much as collapse, as if it could not sustain itself in his presence. The warp recoiled. The demonettes still in real space shrieked and dissolved, not banished by force, but unable to maintain manifestation when confronted with something so fundamentally opposed to their nature. Calvara stumbled backward. Her mind struggled to process what she had seen. Demons were supposed to be inevitable, the ultimate expression of desire unchained, but they had fled, unmade by something that barely acknowledged their existence. She felt her faith cracking. The certainty that had sustained her through years of devotion suddenly felt hollow. Pyramid Head turned toward the cultists. They scattered, running into the darkness of the underhive, abandoning the ritual, abandoning each other. The transcendence they had sought suddenly seemed like a nightmare from which they desperately wanted to wake. But Pyramid Head did not pursue them all. He was not there to kill cultists. He was there for Calvara. She had been the architect of this, the one who spoke the words and spilled the blood and opened the door to damnation. More, she had done it knowing the cost, had recruited others with lies about liberation while knowing it led only to consumption. She was guilty, not of worship, but of the suffering she had inflicted on those who trusted her. She tried to run, made it perhaps 20 meters before her legs stopped working, not paralyzed, just unwilling to carry her further, as if her body understood what her mind refused to accept. That running was pointless. That judgment had arrived and could not be escaped by distance. Pyramid Head walked toward her, blade scraping behind him. That terrible patient sound. She turned to face him, looked up at the pyramid helmet and saw nothing. No eyes, no expression, no hatred or anger or satisfaction. Just inevitability shaped like something that could swing a sword. In that moment she saw everything. Every person she had recruited. Every soul she had delivered to damnation. Every lie she had told herself about transcendence and liberation. The truth of what she had done crashed down on her with more weight than any blade. She opened her mouth to scream or plead or confess, but no sound came. Her heart simply stopped. Pyramid Head stood over her body for a moment, then turned and walked back into the darkness. Behind him, the cult scattered to the winds. Some would try to rebuild. Most would simply try to forget. They had sought a god that promised endless pleasure. Instead, they had found something older, something that did not promise or threaten or negotiate. They had found consequence, And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, that was the most terrifying thing of all. The throne world, center of the Imperium and prison of the Emperor of mankind. Here, in the depths of the imperial palace, beneath layers of security and sanctity and the accumulated weight of 10,000 years, the master of mankind sat upon the golden throne. Not sat, endured. His body was barely alive. A corpse sustained by machinery and the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day. Their souls fed into the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that made warp travel possible across the galaxy. But the Emperor was not dead. His mind endured. Incomprehensible. Stretched across the galaxy through the warp, protecting humanity from demonic incursion through sheer psychic will. He felt every prayer spoken in his name, every battle fought by his space marines, every world burning under Xeno's invasion. The weight of it would have shattered any mortal mind in seconds. But the Emperor was not mortal. Had not been mortal for longer than human civilization had existed. He felt the disturbance. Not loud, not violent, but wrong. A presence in the warp that did not fit any category he understood. Not chaos, not Xenos, not human psyker. Something else. Walking through the Imperium without being consumed. Moving through real space without leaving the signatures he had learned to recognize over millennia of warfare against every horror the galaxy offered. The Emperor focused a fragment of his attention on the anomaly. A fragment was all he could spare. The rest of his consciousness was occupied holding back the tide of chaos, protecting the Astronomicon, shielding humanity from the predations of the dark gods who hungered for every human soul. But even a fragment of his attention was enough to perceive more than any living being could comprehend. He saw Pyramid Head, saw through the warp and real space simultaneously, saw the executioner walking through Hive Ters, saw the deaths left in his wake, saw the pattern, the selection, the judgment delivered without mercy or negotiation. And the Emperor recognized something, not the form, not the specifics, but the principle. He had once walked that path. In the ancient days before the Imperium, before the Unification Wars, when he had been younger and believed that humanity could be perfected through guidance and control, he had judged, he had executed, he had decided who deserved to live and who had forfeited that right through their actions. He had believed in accountability, in consequence, in justice as a force that could shape civilization towards something better. Then the Great Crusade had taught him the limits of justice. The galaxy was too vast, too hostile, humanity too fragile. Justice was a luxury that required peace and resources and time. The Imperium had none of those. Survival required compromise, required sacrificing the few for the many, required atrocities justified by arithmetic. He had made those choices, ordered those sacrifices, buried his earlier ideals beneath the necessity of extinction prevention. But he had never forgotten. Deep in the core of his psyche, beneath the layers of pragmatism and ruthlessness and the cold calculus of species survival, he remembered what it felt like to believe in judgment. To punish not because it was tactically necessary, but because it was right. Pyramid Head was that belief made manifest. Uncomplicated by strategy or politics or the weight of responsibility for billions. He was judgment without compromise, punishment without excuse. The thing the Emperor had once been before 10,000 years of warfare had taught him that purity was a weakness the galaxy punished. And now that purity walked his Imperium, killing those who deserved it by any moral standard, destabilizing the systems of cruelty that kept the imperial machine functioning, forcing accountability on a civilization built on the denial of accountability. The Emperor could not allow it, not because Pyramid Head was wrong, but because he was right. And righteousness in an empire built on necessary evil was an existential threat. If imperial authorities were held accountable for their crimes, the Imperium would tear itself apart. If every official who sacrificed innocence for quotas was punished, the machinery of governance would collapse. If consequence arrived for every brutal choice made in the name of survival, humanity would be too busy judging itself to fight the Xenos in chaos that sought to devour it. But the Emperor also could not stop him. He had tried to reach out through the warp, to communicate, to command as he commanded his space marines and his servants. But Pyramid Head did not hear, did not respond, was not connected to the warp in a way that allowed interaction. He existed outside the hierarchies of power and authority that the Emperor used to maintain control. He was not human, not demon, not anything that could be commanded or reasoned with or destroyed through conventional means. The Emperor felt something he had not experienced in millennia. Not total. He could, if he devoted sufficient attention, manifest enough psychic force to annihilate Pyramid Head. But that would require withdrawing focus from the Astronomicon, from the Great Rift, from the psychic shields that kept Terra from drowning in demonic invasion. For even a moment it would require abandoning his duty to humanity. And Pyramid Head was killing people who deserved to die, not by imperial law, but by the standards of morality the Emperor himself had once held sacred. How could he justify sacrificing humanity's protection to save the guilty from judgment they had earned? He could not, so he watched, observed as Pyramid Head moved from world to world, as reports reached Terra of strange deaths and unexplainable phenomena, as inquisitors and planetary governors pleaded for guidance and received only silence because the Emperor had no guidance to give. How do you fight consequence itself? How do you defend the indefensible? The Emperor turned his attention back to the endless war, back to holding reality together through force of will and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls. He left Pyramid Head to walk his Imperium, not because he approved, not because he had a plan, but because some things are beyond even the master of mankind to control. And perhaps in the deepest part of his consciousness, the part that still remembered idealism and justice and the belief that humanity could be better than its worst instincts, he did not want to stop it. Perhaps some fragment of what the Emperor had once been looked at Pyramid Head and thought, this is what I abandoned. This is what I sacrificed for survival. And perhaps that fragment wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it. On the golden throne, the Emperor of mankind said nothing, did nothing, simply continued his vigil. But in the warp, for just a moment, the psychic light that shielded humanity flickered, not in weakness, but in something that might have been recognition, or regret, or the terrible understanding that righteousness and survival are sometimes incompatible, and those who choose survival must live forever with the ghosts of what they sacrificed to achieve it. Pyramid Head walked on, uncaring, unchanged, judgment incarnate in a galaxy that had forgotten how to judge itself. The reports reached the High Lords of Terra in fragments, scattered incidents from dozens of worlds, unexplained deaths, officials found dead without cause, cult summoning rituals that collapsed mid-ritual, patterns that made no sense individually but formed a disturbing picture when assembled. Something was moving through the Imperium, something that killed with precision and purpose, something that could not be predicted or prevented. The initial response was predictable. Purge protocols. The Inquisition was dispatched to affected worlds with orders to investigate and eliminate the threat by any means necessary. Exterminatus was considered for the most corrupted Hive worlds. Better to destroy a planet than allow whatever this was to spread. But the purges revealed a problem. They could not find a source. No cult coordinating the attacks. No Xenos infiltration. No chaos corruption spreading from world to world. The deaths were isolated incidents united only by the guilt of the victims. And guilt was not something you could purge with fire. Everyone was guilty of something. Planetary governors began to panic as the realization spread. The Imperium functioned through selective enforcement. Laws existed that, if applied universally, would condemn every imperial official. Corruption was not an aberration, it was a feature. The system rewarded those who could bend rules, exploit populations, and deliver results regardless of cost. You rose to power by being ruthless, by making choices that sacrificed others for your advancement, by doing whatever was necessary. And now something was punishing necessary. Administrative paralysis began to spread. Governors terrified to make decisions that might mark them as guilty. Officials refusing to implement policies that, while effective, were morally indefensible. The machinery of the Imperium, lubricated by casual atrocity, began to seize up as those who operated it realized that consequence might finally arrive. On Hive Tertius, Inquisitor Valen received orders from his superiors. Contain the situation. Restore order. By any means necessary. He read the orders and understood what they truly meant. Suppress the information. Execute anyone spreading rumors. Maintain the illusion of control. Do not let the common citizens realize that their oppressors were afraid. He stood in his office and looked at those orders for a long time. He was Inquisitor. He had authority to destroy worlds if the threat was sufficient. He had never hesitated before. The Imperium survived through ruthlessness and the willingness to sacrifice anything for the greater whole. Mercy was weakness. Doubt was heresy. But he was also guilty. He knew this with sudden absolute clarity. Guilty of ordering innocents executed to maintain cover identities. Guilty of allowing entire populations to die from easily preventable plagues because intervention would have revealed inquisitorial operations. Guilty of torturing confessions from people he knew were innocent because someone needed to be blamed. He had justified it all. Necessary sacrifice. The price of protecting humanity from greater threats. But Pyramid Head would not care about justifications. Would not accept that evil done in service of good was somehow sanctified. Would see only the innocents dead by Valen's orders. And judgment would follow. For the first time in his long career, Valen felt fear. Not of death. He had faced death countless times. But of accountability. Of having to answer for choices he had made and could never unmake. He was not alone in this fear. Across the Imperium, those in power began to understand the implications. They ruled through violence and the threat of violence. Through exploitation and the acceptance that some lives mattered less than others. Through systems that ground billions into dust to keep trillions alive. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was arithmetic. Cold, necessary arithmetic. But Pyramid Head was not mathematician. He was executioner. And executioners do not calculate acceptable casualties. They only count the dead and find who is responsible. The Administratum attempted to compile a threat assessment, to quantify the danger. How many officials had died? Approximately 4,000 across 70 worlds. How many more were at risk? Unknown. What was the pattern of manifestation? No pattern. Who was vulnerable? Anyone guilty of sufficient crime. And there the assessment broke down. How do you define sufficient crime in an Imperium built on crime? Was it sufficient to work slaves to death for production quotas? Every factory overseer did that. Was it sufficient to execute civilians to deny resources to enemies? Every competent military commander had done that. Was it sufficient to hoard wealth while populations starved? The entire noble class did that. If judgment came for everyone guilty of atrocity by moral standards, it would come for the entire Imperium. Every level, every branch, every individual who had climbed high enough to make decisions that mattered. They were all guilty. Guilty of survival. Guilty of doing what the system required. Guilty of being part of a machine that valued species continuation over individual justice. The High Lords met in emergency session. 12 individuals who ruled humanity in the Emperor's name. Each was among the most powerful humans alive. Each commanded resources that could level planets. And each was absolutely terrified that a figure with a red pyramid for a head would manifest in their chambers and force them to face what they had done to reach their positions. They discussed solutions. Send the Space Marine. The Adeptus Astartes could surely destroy this thing. But Pyramid Head was not fighting, was not conquering, was not threatening the Imperium's existence. He was killing criminals. How do you order humanity's greatest warriors to protect the guilty from justice? Petition the Emperor. But the throne world was silent. The master of mankind offered no guidance. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he would not. The High Lords did not know which possibility frightened them more. Declare the affected worlds heretical and destroy them. Exterminatus. The final solution. But new reports arrived daily from new worlds. The manifestations were spreading. Or perhaps they had always been everywhere and only now were being reported. If they destroyed every world where Pyramid Head appeared, they would run out of worlds. In the end, they did the only thing they could do. They lied. Issued statements that the incidents were unrelated. That the Inquisition had identified the threat as a new form of chaos corruption and was implementing countermeasures. That Imperial citizens should remain faithful and obedient and trust in the protection of the God Emperor. But in the quiet moments, in the sealed chambers where the powerful spoke honestly to each other, they admitted the truth. They had no countermeasures, no solutions, no understanding of what they faced. They could only hope that Pyramid Head's attention fell on someone else. That their own guilt, vast as it was, would be lost in the ocean of atrocity that was the Imperium's daily operation. And in the lower hives, in the factorums and undercities and forgotten corners of a million worlds, the common citizens whispered different stories about a figure who walked in silence, who punished those who thought themselves above punishment, who brought consequence to the powerful for the first time in 10,000 years. They did not worship him, did not build shrines or offer prayers, but they hoped, quietly, secretly, that judgment would continue. That for once in the long and terrible history of the Imperium, those who made others suffer would themselves know fear. It was not rebellion, not yet, but it was something, a crack in the foundation, a question that had not been asked in millennia. What if the powerful could be held accountable? What if there was something that could not be bribed or threatened or destroyed? What if consequence was real? The Imperium had no answer, and that silence was more threatening than any army. Months passed. Perhaps years. Time moved strangely when tracking something that existed partially outside normal reality. Pyramid Head continued his walk through the Imperium, world after world, hive after hive, finding the guilt, delivering judgment. The pattern held. But something was changing. The manifestations became less frequent, not because the guilty were fewer. The Imperium generated guilt like a forge generated heat, constant. But Pyramid Head's appearances grew sporadic. Sometimes weeks would pass between incidents. Then a cluster of deaths across multiple worlds simultaneously. Then silence again. Inquisitors studying the phenomenon noted something disturbing. The executioner seemed to be fading, not dying, not weakening, but becoming less distinct, less defined, as if his form was losing coherence. Witnesses who survived encounters reported that he seemed more shadow than substance, that the red pyramid was darker, the blade dragged slower, the presence less overwhelming. Serene, the sanctioned psyker who had examined the early death scenes on Hive Tertius, proposed a theory that disturbed Inquisitor Valen. Pyramid Head was a manifestation, created by guilt to punish guilt. In Silent Hill he had one subject, one person whose sin summoned him into being. His purpose was specific. Punish this individual for this crime. But in the Imperium, guilt was infinite, distributed across trillions. Diluted by, there was no single subject, no individual whose punishment would complete his purpose. He was trying to judge a galaxy, and you cannot punish infinity. The task was too large. He was executioner without execution, sentence without end, judgment that could never be completed. And so he was unmaking himself, not through external force, but through the impossibility of his own purpose. He existed to deliver consequence. But in a galaxy where atrocity was structure rather than aberration, consequence had no endpoint. He could kill forever and change nothing. The Imperium would continue. The guilty would be replaced by the equally guilty. The system would persist because it was not built on individuals but on incentives and necessities that transcended personality. Pyramid Head was learning, in whatever way something that was not quite alive could learn, that punishment without the possibility of redemption was meaningless. Silent Hill worked because individuals could confront their guilt and either be destroyed by it or transformed through acceptance. But the Imperium did not accept guilt, did not allow for transformation. It simply generated more of what it had always been. On a war-torn world designated only as Kravis Vici, Pyramid Head manifested during the aftermath of a siege. The Imperial Guard had broken a rebel resistance through orbital bombardment that leveled 3 cities. Millions dead. The general who gave the orders stood in the command post, reviewing casualty reports with the dispassion of someone calculating resource expenditure. Pyramid Head appeared in the command post. The guards raised weapons. Lost bolts passed through him as if he were smoke. The general turned and faced the executioner without flinching. He was old, had fought in dozens of campaigns, had ordered thousands of such strikes. He understood that the Imperium ran on blood, and the only question was whose blood and how much. He looked at Pyramid Head and spoke, not pleading, not defiant, just stating fact. If I had not given that order, the rebellion would have spread. More worlds would have fallen. More millions would have died. The math was simple. 3 cities or 30 worlds. I chose 3 cities, as any competent commander would. Pyramid Head raised his blade, held it there. The general waited. Around them the command post was silent. Aides frozen. Guards uncertain. The moment stretched. Then Pyramid Head lowered the blade, turned, walked through the wall as if it were not there, left the general alive, confused. It was the first time witnesses had ever seen him withdraw. The first time he had arrived and not delivered judgment. Word of it spread quickly through Inquisitorial networks. Analysis paralyzed investigators. Had he found the general innocent? The man had ordered millions dead. Had the executioner malfunctioned? Lost coherence? Or had he realized something? Valen studied the reports and understood. Pyramid Head had confronted the central problem of judging the Imperium. The general was guilty, but the general was also correct. His choices, however brutal, were mathematically sound. Punishing him would not change the calculus that made such choices necessary, would not alter the structure that turned humans into expendable resources, would not redeem the dead or prevent future atrocities. Judgment, Valen realized, required the possibility of justice. And justice required a system that valued individuals over species survival. The Imperium had abandoned that 10,000 years ago. Pyramid Head could kill every guilty individual in the galaxy, and it would change nothing. The system would simply promote new individuals who would make the same choices because the alternatives were extinction. He was executioner in a civilization where execution was already constant. Punishment in an empire built on punishment. Consequence in a reality where consequence was the governing principle of existence. He was redundant, not unnecessary, but overwhelmed by scale until his function became meaningless. After Kravis Feechai sightings became rare, Pyramid Head still appeared occasionally. On worlds where guilt was undeniable even by imperial standards. Where officials committed atrocities not because they were necessary but because they enjoyed them. Where cruelty exceeded what even the brutal arithmetic of survival could justify. He came for the sadists. Those who inflicted suffering beyond what efficiency required. But the merely ruthless. The commanders who sacrificed thousands to save millions. The governors who exploited workers to meet quotas that prevented planetary starvation. The inquisitors who burned the innocent to stop chaos corruption. He left them, not forgiven, but unpunished. As if he had learned the difference between evil done from necessity and evil done from pleasure. Or perhaps he had simply given up, accepted that in a galaxy too guilty to be judged, he could only address the edges. The extreme, the outliers who were cruel even by standards of a cruel civilization. Pyramid Head walked slower now. The blade dragged heavier. The red pyramid seemed duller. He was fading, not dying, but becoming less relevant. An executioner in a galaxy that had learned to function despite guilt, or perhaps because of it. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, he continued walking, searching for purpose in a universe where punishment had become too common to mean anything. The battlefield was silent now. 3 days since the last shot was fired, 5 days since the last scream. The war had moved on. Left behind only corpses and the ruins of cities that had been worth dying for when the fighting started but seemed pointless now in the aftermath. Pyramid Head walked through the wreckage, stepping over bodies in uniforms from both sides. Imperial Guard and rebels rotting together under a sky choked with ash. Neither side had won. The Imperium had eventually deployed enough resources to crush the rebellion, but the cost had been high enough that victory felt hollow. The world was compliant again. Also worthless. Burned to baseline. Another casualty in the endless war. He walked past a destroyed church. The Aquila emblem half melted by fire. Past a schoolhouse reduced to rubble. Past playgrounds where children would never play again. His blade dragged through mud and blood and the gray ash that covered everything. That patient scraping sound echoing through the empty streets. Survivors watched from broken windows. Not many. Those who remained were either too injured to flee or too broken to move. They saw him pass and felt nothing. No fear. No hope. Just exhaustion. He was one more strange thing in a galaxy full of strange things. One more horror in a life saturated with horror. He stopped at a mass grave. Thousands of bodies bulldozed into a crater left by orbital bombardment. Civilian. Imperial dead deemed not worth transporting for burial. All mixed together, indistinguishable now, just meat returning to Earth. Above the grave, a sign had been planted. Casualties were necessary for compliance. The Emperor protects. Pyramid Head stood before that sign for a long time. If he felt anything, his posture did not reveal it. The red pyramid reflected nothing. The blade rested in the mud. Around him, the wind moved through ruins and carried the smell of decay. Eventually he turned, continued walking, leaving the dead to their silence. In distant systems, life continued. The Imperium ground forward. Quotas were met. Wars were fought. Citizens lived and died in numbers too large to comprehend. The machinery of civilization continued its terrible work, converting human life into resources, pain into compliance, suffering into the fuel that kept humanity alive for one more generation. Occasionally, someone would die unexpectedly. A commander known for cruelty beyond tactical necessity. An official who tortured for pleasure rather than information. A noble who raped servants and called it privilege. They would be found dead. No marks, no explanation. Just that expression, that terrible realization. And people would whisper about the figure with the red pyramid, about judgment that could not be escaped. The story spread across worlds, changed in the telling. Some claimed he was a saint sent by the emperor. Others said he was a demon of a new kind. Most agreed he was probably just another horror in a galaxy overflowing with them. But the whispers persisted. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, in an empire where power was absolute and the powerful were untouchable, the idea that consequence might still exist for those at the top was too important to let die, even if it was just a story. Even if the truth was more complicated and less satisfying. Pyramid Head became myth, less frequent than ghost, more legend than presence. But the myth did something the reality never could. It made the powerful hesitate, made them wonder if that next atrocity, that next unnecessary cruelty, might be the one that summoned the executioner. Made them slightly more careful, slightly less sadistic. Not good, not redeemed, but marginally restrained by the possibility of consequence. And in a galaxy where mercy was weakness and justice was forgotten, even marginal restraint was something. A small pressure against the endless momentum toward total brutality. Not enough to change the system, but enough to make individual choices slightly less horrific. To save a few lives, to prevent a few atrocities, to preserve some tiny fragment of the humanity the Imperium claimed to protect. Pyramid Head walked on, through ruined cities and burning worlds. Through the aftermath of wars and the silence that followed slaughter. He was fading, becoming more symbol than substance. But symbols can endure when flesh cannot, can persist across generations, can change behavior through belief even when the original is gone. The galaxy continued its endless cycle, chaos spreading, Xenos pressing at borders, humanity fighting for survival with every tool available, no matter how brutal. The Emperor endured on his golden throne. The Imperium ground forward. Nothing changed. But somewhere, in the space between reality and the warp, in the darkness where guilt accumulated like sediment at the bottom of an ocean, Pyramid Head walked. Slower. Less defined. But still walking. Still searching. Still ready. Because guilt never disappears. It only waits. And when it becomes unbearable, when the weight of what has been done crushes even the excuses and justifications, when someone finally cannot live with what they have become, the executioner will find them. Not salvation, not redemption, not forgiveness, just consequence. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is the closest thing to justice the galaxy will ever know.